Welcome to the Whole Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you become a fat burner, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey everybody, it's Debbie Potts, the host of the Whole Athlete Podcast, and I have a guest on the show that I've never podcasted with, but I did meet him way back when at the Superhuman Coach Conference Ben Greenfield put on back in 2013, I think it was. It was right, this conference he had in Spokane was just right on the onset of my breakdown of my chronic stress disease, I say, or metabolic chaos, my adrenal dysfunction, exhaustion, HPA access. But anyways, all that information that we're learning in our Superhuman Coach program and my experience in Ironman that I started racing back in 2001 was all coming together at the Superhuman Coach Conference, and not knowing what was going to happen to me a month after that conference. But one of the people that I talked to and was really interested in his research and what he was studying and sharing, his name is Peter Defty. And Peter was talking back then about this weird bee something other product called Vespa. And I have followed him throughout the years and keep hearing his name periodically as we kind of reconnect back in the fat adapted world and working on becoming more of a metabolically efficient athlete, how we can enhance our fat oxidation, our fat metabolism. And Peter Defty's really done a lot of research, including the FASTER study, and he's worked with Volek and Finney, who, if you don't know who they are, you should definitely go back and read their book. And they have all worked together to help create more research for us low-carb, fat-adapted athletes, or those striving to improve our performance and longevity in the endurance world. They're kind of more on the cutting edge. But Peter has his own story, as everyone does have in this industry, why they do what they do and what their passion, purpose, and mission is. Peter's story is started over a decade ago in the keto craze, way ahead of the keto crazes I talk about. We didn't even know what keto was back when I was getting into metabolic efficiency and trying to do lower carb and the zone diet and all that back in 2003, 2004. Peter was the same way. He pioneered the current low-carb performance movement using a fat-adapted approach that's evolved over the years called OFM, Optimized Fat Metabolism Program. And like any true innovator, Peter is roundly ridiculed and he's dismissed by the experts, even though the athletes he's worked with were consistently winning and setting course records at many of the prestigious ultra-endurance races, competitions. This included coaching the cohort from the groundbreaking FASTER study, which clearly demonstrated that there is a much larger role for fat utilization than the previous science suggested was possible. Because a lot of the research out there was never conducted on a high-fat, low-carb diet. All the performance research, from what I've found and have heard about, was based on carbohydrates. So there's not a lot of research in the past on a higher fat diet for endurance athletes. So it's becoming more and more research coming out thanks to Volek and Finney and people as Peter Defty. But data emerging from these studies has been happening more, and Peter has been working with athletes and demonstrating for years regarding the competitive edge for the fat-fueled performance approach. And he's been challenging the current science, as a lot of us have. And one of our rare opportunities to gain insights into the shift, the paradigm shift of the horizon of sports physiology, nutrition, metabolism, by one of the few pioneers actually making it happen in the real world, which is Peter Defty. And we need to get him speaking and doing more posts on social media because I think his message needs to get out there. as it gets confusing, because a lot of the information, as we'll discuss today on the show, relates to the keto athletes, the keto endurance, the fat adapted athlete, low carb, high fat athlete, wherever you are. It's kind of all the same thing. We're trying to train the body to burn fat for fuel and spare muscle glycogen until we need it. But what we'll talk about is the carb dosing and how many carbohydrates we can tolerate without going into a blood sugar roller coaster and having GI distress. And there's an appropriate time to add more carbohydrates in your body. And people that are keto, most of the research, as we discuss, and what I've found is based on people with more chronic diseases and people that can really benefit from the low carb, high fat, nutritional ketosis approach. But endurance athletes a little different. So we have to work on N=1 and experiment with your carb placement in your nutrition plan. But Peter really will help us explain a little bit more about fat oxidation and how he can push the boundaries in human performance through fat as fuel approach. And this is one of those rare opportunities to gain insights in the paradigm shift on the human performance world and really see how we can make things happen if we all work together. So we'll use a code, the whole athlete, that we will be getting him to send us a link to add into the show notes. But we've got so many questions I wrote out, and so we didn't get through all of them. I did ask some questions, some social media questions we had on there about UCAN and how to use Vespa. But definitely we're going to do a part 2 to this podcast because it was hard to get focused and stick on just our questions, but I had more than my typical 3 questions to get started. So enjoy the podcast and stay tuned for our part 2 coming up in a few weeks. Enjoy. Thanks for coming on the show today and talking shop with me.
It's my pleasure, Debbie.
Well, we met way back when we were at the Superhuman Coach Conference that we just had once with Ben Greenfield, and that was, I think, 2013. Yeah.
It was the beginning of 2013.
That was the beginning of my downhill spiral with my adrenal exhaustion, HPA axis dysfunction. So it's that seminar. I met so many amazing people that were attending the event and speaking at the event that it's so fun to see kind of where everyone's come around now that it's 2019 and all the transformations and impact everyone there seems to be making the world, including yourself with all of your programs and education and research. So talk a little bit about your journey, how you got to be what you're doing now, and we'll kind of touch on it and then dive deeper.
Well, I've never been like a vegetarian or a vegan or really hyper conscious about my diet or anything. So what started it for me was way back in 99 or 2000. I can't remember the date, but it started with my first marathon. And I did the traditional carb loading, even though that wasn't what I did in my training. I mean, we did some 20, 22-mile runs and did my normal diet and knew that protein was important in that. But I did the carb loading at the first marathon I did. And about mile 18, the wheels started to come off and I was running a sub 3-hour pace. And, between mile 18 and the finish, it just was a slow progression to where the last couple miles, dashboard lights were coming on, system failures were going in, and, the whole tunnel vision and a slow bonk. And I managed to finish. I managed to get a Boston qualifier in my first marathon, but the experience just really shook me, especially after having some long training runs where, we were eating lots of protein and not carb loading and everything went fine. So it got me to start this whole thought process I've always had about, what were those evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans. And I just came to the conclusion right away that it was protein and fat. And it wasn't like no carb, but I added back a lot of protein and fat into my diet before a marathon and ran 3 more marathons subsequent to that within the next 3 months and had no trouble at all. And that's what started me off on my personal journey. And I got into trail running and ultras in 2002 or 3. And at that point, I was starting to share this idea with a couple of close friends I was running with, and started to kind of help them along on that. And then in 2008, or 2006, I got drawn for the Western States 100. So it was in 2005 that I got drawn, and then I raced it in 2006. And I had a good run, and about a month before, somebody tossed me a couple pouches of Vespa and said, try these. My friend Mojo swears by them. And because I was, open to that whole idea of fat as a viable energy source, and their whole shtick was performance based on a fat burning physiology and not just carbs. I used it, and I ran the 2006 Western States, and I went under 24 hours, and that was a year that it got super, super hot, and the trail conditions were really bad because it was a late year for snow, and the trail crews couldn't get in to clean it out. And it was a lot more, Western States was a lot more, shall we say, rugged than it is now. And I think the winning time probably wouldn't have made it in the top 15 or 20 of this year's Western States, which was a cool year, and the top 10 people broke 15 hours. I think the winning time was like either 17 hours, high 17, like 17 hours and 38 minutes, or 18 hours that year. And only half the field finished, whereas like this year in a cool year, like 86% of the field finished. So it was a tough year. I had a good run, and that kind of got me going. So I started talking with Vespa and eventually became an equity partner in the company and started doing this as my day job in 2008. And that's when I got the big surprise.
The big surprise. Tell us about that.
Well, the big surprise was I was sort of like in my own vacuum of this whole idea of fat as fuel. And when I started to kind of do it as my day job, I got this big surprise. It was still all about the carbs. And very few people, were even open to the idea. And a lot of my early adopters were endurance athletes who just basically run out of options. Their stomach, and mostly it was stomach and gut GI issues, and the energy fluctuations, and they tried everything out there and nothing was working. So they were desperate, and they knew that what I was doing was working for some people. And slowly but surely, I started to build a pool of talent based on pukers.
Well, I think that's where everyone got back when we started doing all this. And, I was doing 2001, started doing Ironmans and started doing low heart rate training, the Maffetone method, and Mark Allen in 2004. And I think it's to the point that you're saying is those people that started searching early on about how do we stop this GI stress and how do we get our body to burn fat. We all kind of had our own like aha moment, like this doesn't make sense what we're being told. And we started experimenting on your own. And those people that are searching for help way back then were the ones that were like, okay, I'm tired of throwing up during a race and going porta potty. It's like, how do I fix this? It almost seems like back when we were doing this, and a lot of people were just searching for help, just same story as we had. That it's like, all right, this isn't normal to be eating on the bike ride in an Ironman and throwing up everything on the Ironman too.
Yeah. And the problem was I was doing a lot like I'm a real big fan of Phil Maffetone. The guy truly is a Renaissance man because, now his big focus is music. But, I've got all his books, including the first editions. And back then, the Maffetone method, the idea of carbohydrate restriction and the 2-week test was, because Phil was working with a pool of pretty high level athletes like Mark Allen and Stu Middleman and Mike Pigg and all these people who were really fit. They weren't doing the same level of carbohydrate restriction as we were. I know I've got one of the first editions of his books, and the idea, his 2-week test was to go from whole grain, processed grains to whole grains, and that's not a slam. It's just that when you're working with people who are high level, and especially if they're male, that's about all you need to do. And when you look at the original carb loading studies that came out of Sweden, which was really good science, you have to also look at the subjects and the context of the study, and that was done back in the early 60s when it was well known and well advocated that competitive athletes had a lot of protein in their diet. So if you're and that meant red meat, eggs, things like that. And one of the things that people don't realize is any kind of whole food protein source has a significant amount of fat as its calories. Like a well-marbled ribeye steak can be up to 70% fat calories, right?
Yeah.
And whole eggs are 30%. If you're eating the yolk, you get 30% of the calories are fat calories. So it's not like they're low fat at all. And so you look at those original carb loading studies, and they were taking highly competitive young male athletes, and they put them through a mild carbohydrate restriction. Okay, so they were already well conditioned aerobically, pretty good fat burners to begin with, but just that mild carb restriction that you see with that's the same as what Bill was doing in the 90s. That's all it took to get those guys really to get a punch, and then bringing back the carbs just added to their performance. But that doesn't, it's a very different model when you have somebody who's in middle age, who's been led to believe they need to eat a high carb, low fat diet to perform, and they're chronically eating all those carbs. So, what happened was I was just by default getting the macros without counting them into a level where there was enough restriction to induce that big physiological shift you see with a ketogenic diet, but not prolonging the ketosis to the point where you downregulate your pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme pathway, which I know people are going to go like, what this guy's talking about, but people need to recognize that PDH, pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, that's really key for metabolism of glucose. So that's one of the problems with chronic keto is you can't access your sugar when you need it because you don't have the enzymes to get that quick energy. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of where it was back then, and so
it's definitely evolved over the years, and I know Maffetones really has lots of changes he's made with it, getting experimenting. Everyone's kind of evolved from learning from our self experiments and research, and we'll get into the faster study and Volek and Finney what they've done. But let's kind of backtrack a little bit and kind of build up the questions. I wanted to start with are, just briefly, so this could be one whole episode of talking about a brief explanation how to understand what fat metabolism, fat oxidation is, as you're just kind of touching on a little bit. And then we'll talk about why the importance of endurance athletes should be burning fat, and we'll kind of transition from there into
that's a great place to start, Debbie, because there's a lot of misconceptions and misinformation. And I want to qualify that. It's all well intended. Everybody out there who's in this health and fitness and performance sphere, they genuinely intend well, but a lot of the stuff is out of context and just plain wrong. And so let's start with the first thing. And fat adaptation, I don't like to use the word keto because that's become like this big buzzword. And again, it's well intended, but most of the people out there who are doing it, including some of the experts, are overlooking what the keys of fat adaptation are. And when we're talking about fat adaptation, we're really talking about a physiological process called beta oxidation. That's what does the heavy lifting. That's your base load of fat metabolism. Ketosis is a byproduct, and even ketosis, I can go way into the weeds, and we might save that for Ling, but ketosis is something in terms of beta hydroxybutyrate into the blood for use as an energy substrate. That is a significant source of energy, but it's not the source of energy that everybody in the ketosphere seems to be propagating that it is. I mean, you hear this all the time that your brain runs on ketones or your body now runs on ketones, and nobody talks. They don't even know that there's this process called beta oxidation, which is, you're able to access these big, long, stable fatty acid chains that are just packed full of energy, and just start cleaving them off, feeding them in as acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle, and just you have that, that solid base load of energy that you can actually race upon. And then using ketones and carbohydrates, both your internal carbohydrates from glycogen and external carbohydrates and ketone esters, then you can use those for that extra topping off fuel. And ironically, fat adaptation actually facilitates the use of carbohydrates and ketone esters. because you have that big base, and because now instead of trying to fuel a big part of your spectrum of energy production with, glycogen, exogenous carbohydrates, exogenous ketone esters or ketone salts, you're now using those to top off for that performance edge you need. So that would be how I term it. And I don't like to get too caught up in the metrics. We use them as tools and use them to, I suggest people look at them like data and metrics as a way to confirm what you're actually experiencing, which means you don't have the hunger cravings, you're not bonking, you're able to perform well on doing a fasted train run. I'm sure you've had these things where you can just go out and do a fasted workout and feel great. You feel very clean because you don't have this digestive load, and you get done, you're not hungry, and you'll go a couple hours before you decide to eat. And it's not, I'm hangry, I got to eat now, or I'm going to rip somebody's head off. It's, it's time to eat.
So you're saying you don't think athletes don't necessarily need to test their blood sugar and ketones to see if they're burning fat? I
coach people away from that, because I think that creates a lot of stress, because it's conscious thought.
Yeah.
And I want people to focus on getting in the zone. Like I said, the primary question I have to find my answers that I always go back to is what were the evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans? And we didn't measure things there. We just did and performed. And when you look at some of these anthropological records of what humans were capable of back then with no, formal training, it's really amazing. And so we have the capability of taking that experience, taking our own experience and our ability to provide some level of structure. But, when it comes to racing, you want to develop the athlete as good as you can, but there's still that element of the human spirit, the intuition, that getting in that zone that Mark Allen talks about, that makes you able to compete at the highest levels. And so, and people know it when they're there. I'm sure you've been that place, and you're not checking your power. You're not checking how fast you're going on the bike. You're just like locked in, and your eyes are looking in front, and you're in that predatory mode and going after it.
Yes. Yeah, I just wrote a blog about that the other day. It's like, do you let yourself get there? But yeah, so you're saying if you're testing.
I think that testing, collecting data, like the way I do it is I have athletes collect data. They don't look at it during their workouts. And then we look at it after, and then talk about how they felt, what they thought was going on, and connect the data to those experiences so they can confirm it. And it gives the athlete a lot of confidence. Now, when it comes to things like blood glucose and ketones, because of a lot of misinformation, it also sometimes backfires with athletes, because, we have to keep in mind that the body of science with nutritional ketosis today is almost, 99% of it, save for the FASTER study and maybe one or two other studies, is based on sedentary people and metabolically compromised people. Okay.
Exactly.
And so one of the big things we see is not everybody, but the majority of well-conditioned, fat-adapted athletes tend to run subclinical ketone levels.
Yeah. So I just want to add this comment into what you're going to say next, probably, is this week there happens to be this 5-day keto challenge with people measuring their ketones every day. And athletes, their ketones, if you're exercising a lot, because most people, as you're saying, that I know I've met at conferences a lot lately, they're not endurance athletes. So it's really confusing, I think, to apply this information to an endurance athlete doing a fat burning long distance exercise versus someone just doing nutritional ketosis for the health benefits, is what we're both saying. And so those athletes that are testing their ketones every morning, they're going to be different numbers. And I was listening or reading people's comments today, actually, like, oh my gosh, I'm only 0.1 or 0.2 and, I'm not in ketosis, but they're exercising, and just how it fluctuates during the day and how your ketone measurements and blood sugar will differ per the timing, but also what you did for your workout and when. And And if you
Well,
can
and
touch on that.
people, because we've been sold and told these ideas, and everybody's got this stupid herd mentality. You got me unfiltered now, Debbie.
It's okay.
It's like, wait a second, people. If you're a fat adapted, highly aerobic athlete, it's not what's in your blood, it's what you burn. So if you can go out on a fasted workout and kill it, you're burning a lot of ketones. There's no other way around it.
That's what I always say. So if you are burning fat, I'm eating lower carb, high fat, I'm exercising fasted, I have a steady balanced blood sugar, I'm working out and I feel energized and I feel good afterwards, I'm not tired, I would assume I'm burning ketones as a byproduct of fat metabolism.
Yeah, what and ketones, see, the problem is in the modern human construct, not nature and evolution and all these things that are beyond us to measure. We measure things. We like to measure.
Yeah.
And ketones are a good proxy to measure and study because we can collect data on them. And I'm not trying to knock that as science. I think it's great because it's brought us a lot of discovery, but all of a sudden we have this hyper focus on what we can measure rather than what we're actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and once again, that's why I tend to coach away from that, because it takes the focus off of what the goal is. And that's to be that intuitive athlete that can just, get locked in and laser locked and have the confidence to know that on any given day they can go out and crush it.
Exactly. So I know we can talk for hours.
That's actually one of the benefits of fat adaptation.
Yes.
Is the emotion, the mental focus, the mental clarity, and the emotional stability. You just have this stability that, okay, bring it on.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And just kind of tying this into what my next question was is, why endurance athletes should be fat adapted. And then part 2 is that what is the biggest training and fueling error endurance athletes have? Okay.
Remind me on the second question, but
why endurance athletes should be fat adapted, and then we'll go into it kind of ties into the other questions, the biggest errors.
Almost any athlete should be fat adapted, unless you just want to, because I think almost everybody who is an athlete, part of that, the component of that, and probably a subconscious, and for a lot it's a conscious thought, but it's also a big subconscious thought, is if you want to be the best performing, you also want to have your cake and eat it too, which means you want to be as healthy as you can. And fat adaptation for any sport, and we're going to touch on this too, is that foundation, and that's what people don't look at. They look at the last thing in the line, the shotgun approach, and they see, oh, I add more carbs, or I take a 5-hour energy or Red Bull and I get a result. Then, they come crashing down again and they take another one, they get a result. They notice that. And fat adaptation gives you not only that big platform that you can grow upon, but what the other half of fat adaptation that people aren't talking about is it's not just for energy. All your biological physiological processes are based on lipid metabolism. So the regeneration of cell walls, hormones, blood, plasma, your skin, your hair, all these physiological functions that go are based on lipids. Carb metabolism is just an energy metabolism. And so, if you want to build your mitochondria up, you need to be optimizing your fat metabolism. That's why I call my program Optimized Fat Metabolism, because I when I started to look at this thing in a very holistic way, it didn't have to do just with energy production. It has to do with everything else, and hormonal balance, enzyme production, all these things. We're meant to burn fat aerobically, and glycogen is our fight or flight fuel.
Which is why probably a lot of athletes break themselves down, because they're training too high of heart rates and burning carbohydrates for fuel because the way they're training what they're eating.
Right. And it's because we have a robust fight or flight fuel source, but we've turned that into our main energy source. Look at the marathon, look at, sprint and only distance. They're telling you to use your glycogen up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why fat adaptation is really important for any athlete. I really believe and it changes for the endurance athlete. The more fat adapted you are, the bigger, the gains there are much more pronounced and obvious. But when you're talking about an athlete that's playing, say, a sport like, we're going to go all the way the other end of the spectrum. Let's look at men's figure skating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a men's figure skating long program is 4 minutes. Okay, but that athlete has to be on, hyper focused, motor skills, sharp bursts of energy. Okay, the shift to being fat adapted to that makes you blood sugar stable. And blood sugar, and what happens is the first thing to degrade when you start to have any kind of tiny, minute blood sugar drop is your fine motor skills and focus. Before you even recognize fatigue, before you even recognize something's off, you've already degraded your ability to perform. And that's where, fat adaptation for a sport like that, or golf, or something like basketball or soccer, any of these team sports that requires
focus
as well as an aerobic capacity. Because say soccer or basketball, it's a run and gun sport. So you have to be both aerobic and have that sharp boost. Plus you have to have the focus and motor skills to shoot, dribble, or kick and shoot. So that's where fat adaptation, that incremental gain in fat adaptation, is going to allow you to better utilize your glycogen stores, better utilize those quick bursts. The other reason has to do on the more physiological cellular level. Is just you're going to build more mitochondria, more mitochondrial density. You're going to have more robust, healthier mitochondria, because the more you burn fat through beta oxidation in particular, the less oxidative stress you have, the less lactate load you have. And once again, like ketones, lactate's a marker for fatigue. And so when you have a lot of lactate, it means you burned a lot of sugar. Okay. And you have a lot of people who are, like George Brooks, researcher George Brooks at Berkeley, but you have a lot of people in the nutrition area producing, carb-based stuff that has some lactate in it. Well, lactate can be used as an energy source by various organs, including the heart, and the liver can process lactate, but it's rate limited. And that's why you build up lactate when you do any kind of thing that triggers you, the individual, to burn a lot of glucose. So, you can handle a certain amount of lactate and your body will process it, but once you start burning a lot, it starts to accumulate. And then that's where so just like ketones, it's been a proxy for fatigue and soreness, because whenever you have soreness, you have high lactate.
Yeah, it's recovering too and adapt to that.
Right. And being fat adapted, the less lactate you produce, the less oxidative stress you produce, the less damage you're doing. And that's the reframing I'm trying to do in the recovery sphere, because everybody's talking about recovery, and it's like, no, let's not talk about recovery. Let's talk about damage prevention.
Yeah, that's true, because we can talk about recovery repair, but it's how you're training to prevent that excessive damage you're doing to your body and mitochondria health.
That's exactly right. And you don't recover faster because you recover faster. You recover faster because you've not done the damage.
So that kind of goes into the next question section I have for us. The FASTER study, I don't know where you want to go first, but talking about the OFM program and the FASTER study, and then we'll talk about restricting carb loading and tying that all together, how to become a fat adapted athlete. What area do you want to start, the FASTER study or OFM?
Start with the FASTER study. And that was a seminal study that ironically hasn't gotten the traction it really should have.
Yes, exactly.
Because it really did change the science to date. It was a profound shift because prior to the FASTER study, you always heard that you couldn't use fat as a good substrate for performance, because the science, the data to date, up to publication FASTER, suggested that humans were only capable of burning up to 1 gram a minute. Most athletes actually burn between 1/2 and 3/4 of a gram a minute. Well-conditioned aerobic athletes. That's what they were condition, 0.65 was sort of like 0.55 to 0.65 was grams per minute was thought to be sort of the mean, and then a hyper responder would burn up to a gram a minute. And faster changed all that because the low carb diet cohort was, as a mean, was burning 1.54 grams a minute, and one guy topped out at 1.79 grams a minute. Okay, so that was a fundamental shift, and then the high carb diet cohort, which were well conditioned, aerobically well conditioned ultra runners, they were all burning 0.65 grams a minute as a mean.
Wow.
And that was right at, they were on the upper end of what was considered normal in the previous body of science. So the high carb athletes actually fit lockstep with both the fatty acid oxidation and the crossover, right? You're familiar with the crossover point. And for you, those of you in the audience who don't know that, that's where you cross over from burning primarily fat to burning carbohydrate. And up until faster, it was thought that the best an athlete could do was 60 to 65% of their VO2 max was where they crossed over. And in faster, it became 75 to 80% of their VO2 max, which is the sweet spot for racing in any kind of ultra endurance, like, Ironman distance or ultras, stuff like that. And so that was the fundamental shift. Plus, when you add in the fact that it's more significant when you take into consideration, and I hope I can articulate this well enough, but you're not only able to burn fat at that higher race pace intensity level, but you're also burning so much more fat that it becomes a big game changer. Okay, for the endurance athlete.
Yep. That metabolic, that's what I used to do, the New Leaf metabolic testing cart. And you could see, and I just actually found my old files, that I was still burning 10 of fat up to 160 heart rate. Like 158 was my crossover because the way we trained and eating, and that was a long time ago. But that is a great way to see. But in the faster study, the people that were on a ketogenic diet were doing it for like 6 months, or how long was it that they changed the way they ate?
This is one of the problems with this is. And there's a little bit of some people might think I'm doing a little shameless self-promotion here, but this is one of the problems with fast. This is the only problem with faster, even though the science is impeccable. The low carb diet cohort were on a keto.
Froze. Say that again. You were just frozen.
Oh,
so.
the
The ketogenic diet.
Yeah, am I still?
Yeah, it keeps doing that every time you say it. You're not supposed to say it, I guess, because it keeps freezing. So one more time, see if it's right.
All right, here we go. All right. So the low carb diet cohort was on a ketogenic diet during the data collection. So they kept them straight keto. And this is, but in the real world, they followed the OFM protocol. Nobody's racing and training on a straight keto thing. And that's one of the subtle things that is missed in the faster study because the focus is on the ketogenic diet.
So what's the difference?
Well, with OFM, we use a ketogenic diet as one tool. So, there's sometimes, particularly in the recovery phases, where the macros look like a ketogenic diet and I don't like to have people use metrics. Once again, I tell them just eat whole food protein sources and add fat, as needed to cook it in or to put a sauce on, and eat non-starchy vegetables and non-starchy fruits. You eat like vegetables and add dressing or oil either to cook it in or a salad dressing. Okay. And that's my idea of a ketogenic macro.
Okay. So we should back up. Why don't you say what OFM is, since we kind of jumped ahead?
It's an acronym. It's an acronym for optimizing fat metabolism, optimize fat metabolism. And once again, as I stated earlier, it's not only to provide the highest level of fat oxidation, but also to optimize all those physiological functions you need to perform and to be robust and healthy.
So it's your OFM is a program you put together, your philosophy and research based on experience where to be fat adapted.
Yeah, it was an accidental process that just came as a result of supporting the Vespa product when it became my day job.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that we discovered when I first started it was I had athletes who were using it, and then, back in 2008, 2009, it was still about the carbs. So these ultra athletes, whether it was Ironman or 100-mile runners, they would eat the night before. They would eat tons the morning of. They would start out eating their thing because their whole idea was you had to front load, right?
Yeah.
Because you were going to run out. You couldn't do it. And then once you got extra, and sometimes this Vespa wouldn't work. And then as soon as I got them to stop all that, it was like they had wings.
Literally. Wings.
literally. And it dawned on me that there was something going on. Then I had other athletes that said it didn't work and this and that. So it got me really diving in because I knew it worked for me. And I was like I said, I was in this echo chamber. It worked for me, but everybody else said I was, crazy. Even at Ben's conference, I was the only outside vendor there, but he wasn't having me speak because even though I'd put Ben onto this whole idea, it was still a little too new to be, kind of out there. And so that's kind of where we went with everything. And so it just became this outgrowth. And in working with these athletes and seeing the results and getting the results that we all were seeing, it just kind of kept growing and growing. And then in 2010, I believe it was, I met with Dr. Stephen Finney for the first time and described to him what I was doing with the restriction of carbohydrates, the dietary stuff, the way we're training. He says, yeah, you're doing a ketogenic diet and this is real. He was the first researcher that didn't laugh at me and said this was real.
And we didn't know ketogenic diet was.
Right.
It was new or not known yet, really.
Yeah, and the thing was that he did a bike study in the early 80s that showed a bunch of very interesting things. And that was in the early 80s, right when the U.S. dietary guidelines were being made, when everything went
wonderful food pyramid.
Right, the wonderful high-carb, low-fat food pyramid was. And what happened was after he did that, published that study, his area of research literally became toxic. And all the collaborators that were on those papers actually went into other fields. And Steve has always had a passion for the sport.
Stuck with it.
Yeah. Well, he stuck with it and went into weight loss, developed a very successful weight loss protocol and program in Sacramento, and was a professor at UC Davis, and stuck with the ketogenic diet for the health issues because that's where the funding was and they were getting results in that, right? But he always had this latent thing about the performance side. But unfortunately, one of the things that Steve and Jeff do have is they have this confirmational bias that's all about keto. And it's a much more nuanced thing. And the ketogenic diet, like I said, it's a great foundation. And I want people to understand that using some of the aspects of a ketogenic diet in a ketogenic diet is a great tool to get the performance they really want to get to, plus have the health benefits.
Well, so let's tie that back in so we keep on track, because I know we're short on time. There's like 5 hours we can go on this. So the optimal fat metabolism and carbohydrate loading, if we want to be burning fat when we're exercising and at rest, we want to be fat adapted athletes to be more metabolically efficient. How have your program you created and implementing Vestival we'll get to, but talking about carb restriction, carb loading, the carb timing for, day-to-day activities, but then also like we're doing a really long brick workout or we're peak season and kind of more the seasonal part, how it fluctuates, and then racing.
Well, and this is where people who've done it for a couple of years, and once again, we teach them how to do it intuitively. They say it's the most sustainable way to eat because the general concept is to cycle carbs in and out, but it's not like this structured cycling. I call it strategic because, the environment for an athlete is very, very dynamic. It's always changing. So you can't just say, oh, you got this going on this day, because, say you have a cool day and you're doing a brick weekend and it's cool and it's the middle of winter. Well, you're going to get your best performance by adding a bunch of carbs. But say you're living in the Southeast and it's 90 degrees and 90% humidity, you're not going to eat much and you're going to focus on your hydration. Yeah, right. So it's a very, it's a very dynamic environment. And another thing I think I want to posit in this podcast for the audience is to look at concentrated forms of carbohydrates as a legal PED. Okay, because they fit that definition really well. Because do they enhance your performance? Yes. Right.
Yes.
Are they addictive? Are there physiological consequences for overuse?
It's a drug.
It is, and it can be addictive, and there's substance withdrawal. I mean, all these things. So concentrated forms of carbohydrates. So when I say that,
same to caffeine, right? I mean, if you take caffeine out and then put it in the appropriate time, it's like this boost of energy. Yeah.
And so if people look at things like caffeine and concentrated carbs, not the non-starchy vegetables and non-starchy fruits you eat like vegetables, things like rice, potatoes, bread, and then the gels, simple sugars, liquid nutrition. If you're using those judiciously, you can get all the benefits and minimize the downside impact. And part of the way you use them judiciously is to optimize your fat metabolism, because then you're using a whole lot less and they work better. Now, part of that, when I talked about deep keto and the PDH enzyme, one of the things we do is to make sure we don't downregulate that.
Yeah.
Right? So that you always have that availability so you can access that quick energy. And oddly enough, and this is ironic and counterintuitive, but when you're well fat adapted, you actually can tolerate carbohydrates really well. And so this is one of the things I don't like is, once again, because the studies were all done on sedentary and metabolically compromised people, everybody's like, 50 grams a day, 50 grams a day, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And I've had people make me take, they've returned Vespa because it has 4 grams of honey in it, right? A teaspoon of sugar, people are crapping their pants, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of, and people aren't thinking about this stuff. And so...
So endurance athletes can tolerate a little more carbohydrates and still show you're burning fat. And
it depends on the athlete. It depends on the athlete. But I'm telling you, I've got some young male athletes who are racing at the elite level, and their carbohydrate loading and use looks very much like the original carbohydrate loading studies.
So go back to the enzymes you're talking about. I think that's a good one to explain a little bit more how, as we become, from going from a high carb to low carb, higher fat adapted athlete, we need to have transition period because the enzymes are changing, then also the enzymes to burn carbohydrates. Because I think I've learned that, and I think it's interesting to share that because it's an important part of the adaptation phase and the purpose of why you're doing cyclical keto or adding in those carbs and take them away. I think that's
absolutely.
A great point.
And it's very important, but it's this dynamic matrix with the hormones, and the hormones interact with each other, and especially if you're a female, it gets even more interesting. But you have, when you do say what we call a hard reset, and you do that really sharp carbohydrate restriction and try not to exercise for a few days because you're going to feel off, and make that shift where you're upregulating, the hormones and enzymes to burn fat at a high rate, you don't immediately downregulate your PDH. So you want to balance that out. But the other thing is, because lipids are involved with hormone and enzyme production, as you get fat adapted, your body's better able to respond quickly to shifts. And then there's a guy named I can't remember his name, but anyway, it's Dave, and he's cholesterol code, and he's been able to show. And I was the first person to recognize his work because I'd been seeing these cholesterol numbers he was seeing in himself in athletes we work with. But he's been able to show how quickly cholesterol can move. Okay, same thing with hormones and enzymes, because your hormones are made up of cholesterols. Okay, that's what cholesterol does. But the body becomes highly dynamic in a fat adapted state because it's not having to deal with this excess glucose all the time. Because when you have too much glucose in the system, it's got to get rid of it right away. So you aren't able to metabolize fat at rates you want to, and that things become much more static and are harder to move because it's typically thought that things like blood sugar, hormones, cholesterol, it's 3 months. That's why when you do an HbA1c, they want you to go 3 months and take another one and all that, because the common medical advice based on the current paradigm is it's not as dynamic as what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Like, you see what I'm saying?
No, it's a great explanation because I think a lot of people don't. I think it's important to understand why we need to be fat adapted and how we become fat adapted, and why endurance athletes, people that don't have chronic diseases and inflammation and different areas that they really need to be strict ketosis. But if you're an endurance athlete, you have to be able to add some back in at the appropriate time.
Yeah, and it's actually, so interestingly enough, like I said, the first early adopters I got were pukers, right? They're GI.
Yeah.
So, but now it's kind of funny. I'm still getting pukers, but I'm getting a lot of people who are showing up with significant adrenal stress because they're trying to perform on hardcore keto.
Yes. I think it's a fine line. That's where it's so individual. It's like, where am I causing stress, or where am I improving, decreasing stress? Like the Goldilocks effect, where you can't just everyone do 50 grams a day, like you're saying, total carbs, and figure out what works for you, because it could be damaging.
And that's exactly it. I mean, one of the things I've found is it's all very individualized, and if you want the best, I mean, as we know, anybody that goes on a program, just by going on a program, you're going to get improvements. But are they the improvements that are going to get you the optimal results?
Yeah.
For you, right? Because there's no money in the individual. There's money in making the individual commodity and then mass marketing and scaling, right?
Yeah, that's the whole bio-individual part that we talk about nutritional therapy and working with clients as a practitioner. It's just there is not one size fits all. And that's what I love, how you do the intuitive athlete. And that's kind of what I do, and what I do for myself is like, you can kind of sense what you need. But I think that's a whole coaching program in itself, because so many people do not know how to feel. And I just recorded a podcast on this the other day that we don't have awareness of how we feel and how to be intuitive. I think people lack that ability, but they need to work on it.
It's huge because we've become so ensconced in our human man-made environment that we don't know how to do that anymore. And we're trusting in technology. But ironically, as we drift more into our man-made construct, that we become more dependent on it. And that's why, this thing of measuring, people become obsessed with their metrics.
Yeah. So I have to add in.
That's a fear factor.
It is, but it's additional source of stress. Like, I'm all about teaching people to reduce external stressors and internal stressors we need to test usually. But my client was just telling me this morning, what I just said the other day is all these different apps and tracking and biohacking devices. There's more apps on your phone to really track this, track that. But then when does it become that fine line that the more the testing and measuring you're doing, that's causing additional sources of stress, because then you're hooked on your phone and your data coming back even more, that it's like not really beneficial anymore. That's why I like being more intuitive.
And that's why I also say to people all the time is like the stress is as big a factor as too many carbs in the diet.
Yeah.
If not more. And that can really upset the apple cart in terms of hormonal balance, because of cortisol requiring a lot of pregnenolone, and then all of a sudden that precursor to other hormones is being made into cortisol. So then your other hormones are not getting, ramped up at the levels you need to see. And that's why, whether you're on a high carb diet or straight keto, you find that you're going to run into issues there. And hormonal balancing is really quite a fascinating journey. I mean, another part of aspect is one of the first things we do with all athletes is get them off snacking. Mm-hmm. That's one of the most insidious things there is in terms of upsetting hormonal balance, because of that dance that the hormone insulin, ghrelin, and leptin do when you're constantly feeding yourself. Yep.
Nonstop.
Not to mention what it does to the gallbladder.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting and time restricted eating and having, stop eating before bed. And I think for me personally, it's made a huge difference. And when I coach people in the holistic method coaching programs is like, let's start with what you're eating, but how you're eating and when you are eating, and work on reestablishing balance in your body.
Right. And how little you're eating, because I'm finding more and more that less is more.
Yeah. That's my saying.
It's almost scary. Like some of the athletes I'm working with, it's almost scary how little you need when you get that nutritional balance right.
Yeah.
It's almost scary how little you need, how well you perform, and how good you feel.
I started feeling better because that's my whole thing with chronic stress. And my book, Life is Not a Race, started, all this in 2013 after we had our conference, and was all starting actually right then at that Superhuman Coach conference. And, I just started recently feeling better this year because I think I started that time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and I've always done low carb, high fat, even, way before my adrenal stuff happens, stress. But I think the fasting is really beneficial for athletes. Stop snacking and eating in that restricted period, because then I finally started losing weight, fat weight, and my body changing, and I feel better and I have better sleep, and it's just amazing. So
yeah, it's like I say, there's 101 ways to get keto wrong, and if you're doing keto, low carb for performance, there's 201 ways to get it wrong.
Yeah. Well, I know we'll have to do a part 2 because I know we just have about 5 minutes left, and I want to bring everyone to your website to find more information on OFM and talk a little bit about Vespa and how that can be implemented into the program, but I guess more so why and how we use it and when. And then I had a question by someone on my social media when I was posting our podcast today on how to use it, but also if you can put it in with something like UCAN. So I'll let you take that.
Yeah, a lot of people, for the UCAN users, you can use it very comfortably with UCAN, and actually you'll need less UCAN, because Vespa is a naturally occurring bioactive peptide. And this is a hot area of research in pharma right now, is bioactive peptides that use a process called tight junction signaling, where they can pass intact into the bloodstream. And this is one of the things a lot of people, it's a misconception. A lot of doctors and physiologists think that everything gets broken down in the stomach into constituent amino acids. Well, there's certain proteins and peptides that use this tight junction signaling that allows it to cut past the gut barrier intact. And so this peptide is actually the same as the peptide that's used by the giant Asian wasp to catalyze its ability to access the fat in its thorax. And this is a well-studied process, physiological process in wasps, bees, ants, and termites. They all use the same pathway of this bioactive peptide that the larva feeds to the adult in a symbiotic relationship called trophlaxis. So the adult feeds it food, the larva feeds it this peptide, and that's why when you look at ants, bees, termites, wasps, they're like animals that do super strength, super endurance work. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it was an accidental discovery of nature that these Japanese entomologists were studying this giant wasp, and they found it could fly 60 to 100 kilometers a day and carry a third of its weight in a food ball back. And that's what it did all day. It's like, holy moly, what does it make it? What allows it to do this? And that's when they came across this peptide. And because animal cells are remarkably similar across species, they hypothesized that this could do this in rats and humans. And so they started doing some experiments in Japan, and it did this, and then the process was developed for extracting this peptide, and the product was made. But it's a very expensive product to make, and it's actually not classified as a dietary supplement by the FDA. It's actually classified as a food product because of the fact that it's made from peptides. Food-based substances. Yeah, and so unfortunately, both the original developer, Mr. Kawahara, and myself, we're kind of like results-oriented people. We would rather just do it, and we've kind of been focused on getting people results. And you've seen people win, like Badwater this year was the last 2 years of Badwater. This year, one of the coolest years and a record-setting year was won by a Vespa user. And last year, the hottest year on record was run by a Vespa user. And, we've had people win the Olympic marathon. Several people win the Olympic marathon, Olympic figure skating.
But talk about how you use it, though. Do you take it, I had the samples he sent me. I'm going to try on my bike ride, but I haven't actually taken it, I think, back since I saw you in 2013. But how do we use it?
You take it 45 minutes. There's no preloading for a couple of weeks. You take it 30 to 45 minutes before you exercise. And if you're doing endurance stuff that you're going to be out for more than 3 hours, every 2 hours, 2.5 hours is the window I like to use.
Like how much? Because I know it's a gel pack.
It's a full pouch. A full pack. Yep.
Okay.
And if you're using the ultra concentrate, dilute it in water.
Okay.
Because it's not to be taken as a gel.
Because I think it'd be great. Say I'm going for a 100-mile bike ride tomorrow or Saturday, and I usually fast, and that long ride, I'll have a little something and then coffee in my water, but then take that in the morning and then take it every couple hours, have that. And then, so how do you know if it's working, or what are some symptoms oh my gosh,
that's where I'm going to sound
different.
Like snake oil salesman. Okay, so because it works with your body's natural physiology rather than sidesteps it, right? Like taking a gel or some Coke or a Red Bull, that's sort of like sidestepping your physiology.
Yeah.
So you're working with your own physiology to upregulate your fat metabolism. So what we tell people is what you notice is what you don't notice, which sounds totally like a salesman. But let me finish. You don't notice the ups and downs in energy. You don't notice the mental fog. You're not sore the next day. You're not eating as many calories, and you're not bonking. I've got a client. She's in her 50s, very active but overweight, and wonderful lady. She was chronically hypoglycemic. I've got her on the program. We're working with her. She's using the Vespa religiously. No more hypoglycemia. And she just can't believe that she doesn't need to eat during her exercise workouts anymore. She used to be one of those people that had to eat after she'd exercised for 45 minutes. Otherwise, she'd have a hypoglycemic event. Yep. So that's what you don't notice. And you won't notice the soreness the next day. You'll have more energy. It's very subtle, but when you add it all up, it's pretty significant. And then for performance, it's there.
Well, let me test it out, and we'll do a follow-up podcast. And we have got lots of other questions we didn't get to today. But where can people order their own products and learn about OFM and coaching with you?
Okay, 2 sites, www.vespapower.com for product and ofm.io, like optimized fat metabolism.ioptimize.
Got it. Well, we'll put all the links in the show notes, so make sure you guys go to the page. You see all of our show notes at the very bottom. Click on the link so you can order it yourself. It's a great time of year to try it out, and on your long training events and runs. And people use it racing, I'm sure, after you don't do anything new on race day. So practice with it first. Right?
Yeah. And get to use it. And I think finally, I want to say to people, you got to trust the system, because we've been sold and told this idea we need all these calories. And even the keto people, I got passed over because I'm talking about this catalyst, this voodoo that works with your body, and they're selling you fat bombs, MCT oil, all nut butters. And same thing, trust yourself and trust that you have it on board. And that's a lot of what my coaching has been lately with athletes going into races, is trust that you're going to be there and you're going to be fine. And that's, that from your own coaching. It's hard for people to wrap their heads around it, because we've got this metric, like I need 200, 300, 400 calories on the bike, right? Or 100, 200 calories on the run. And it's like, no, you don't need that. And especially when it's hot, you really don't need anything.
Yeah, I know for sure. And I think I'm not a big person of calculating my carbs and counting things, because I think I'm damaged from dieting so much growing up in my younger years. But I think it is just going by what you feel and experiment with that, not necessarily have to count grams, this many grams, because it does differ per the weather, the race course, and your intensity and what you're feeling that day too.
Yeah.
So Oh, great. So I will put everything in the show notes. And if you guys have more questions, I know we had a couple questions on UCAN and how to do it with Vespa, and someone else asked how to use it properly because they didn't do it right. So I think we answered that a little bit, but we can do follow-up on the Facebook page, The Whole Athlete Podcast. And you can find me on the Low Carb Athlete on Instagram. And are you on social media? You're doing your...
I'm poor at social media.
It's hard to do, I find, because I'm trying to do less is more as well. But
yeah, I love what I do, and I'm into what I'm doing. I don't like to do the social media. I've got a guy that's helping me do more of that marketing, but still not at the level I really want to. But if people want me to answer on your page and stuff, I'm more than happy to help out there. Absolutely, because this is about getting people. The fat adaptation thing, what I've seen, and I'll quote one of my athletes, and I'll send you the link to it. You might want to put it up. It's Beth Hodges, and she's the first, she and her adult PC daughter were the first mother-daughter team to complete an Ironman. And Beth was one time telling me, she goes, I'm a freak, I'm a weirdo. And I told her, I went back to her right away. I said, Beth, no, you're what normal should be.
That's what we said all the time on a cruise. Yeah.
This is what normal should be.
This is what we all should be.
Beth is 54 years old. She completed Ironman Wisconsin last year, which is a hard course.
Yes.
And pulling and pushing on her adult daughter who's physically challenged. Mm-hmm. And they're going to Kona this year.
Oh, good. Well, I have to add into the show that I am creating a meetup and a seminar, how to become a fat adapted athlete in Kona. Hopefully we'll be doing it at Bikeworks store, but we'll be doing a seminar race week on the Wednesday, 4 to 6 p.m. So we'll see if we can get any samples from Vespa to hand out.
Oh yeah, we can arrange that. But that's when they should try it on their race.
I know. Yeah, in the hot weather too.
Yep.
Okay, we got to go, guys, but for sure we'll have Peter back on the show to talk more and finish up on all the questions that I'm sure you will have after listening to this episode. So stay in touch, stay connected, and work on training the whole athlete from the inside out.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at wholeathletepodcast.com. You can help us continue and grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and see you next time.